research. And the fourth person to introduce is Louise Casselman, who lived and worked in Latin America for over 25 years before becoming the director of the Social Justice Fund of the Public Service Alliance of Canada in 2005. She was a longtime member of the Latin American Working Group, which is a solidarity organization that emerged in the late 60s to challenge Canadian foreign policy in Latin America. She also has a long-term experience with the former International Commission for Coordination of Solidarity among Sugar Workers, also experience with the Steelworkers Humanity Fund, Common Frontiers, and other labor and solidarity organizations in Canada and the Global South. Her talk today is entitled Group 1965 to 1997, Relevant Lessons for Today.
I know a few faces, but only a few. But anyway, I just want to mention that I joined the Latin America Working Group, I think it was in 66 or 67. And I joined it out of a need. I had to learn about what was really going on in the world. And there was a project, I was in Ottawa, and there was a project to look at, to go to Toronto, the big megapolis, to study and work on a research project on corporations, finance. I chose finance capital. I'm not sure I did anything really very fancy. I didn't have enough background, but I wanted to learn about how Canadian banking was impacting and being imperialist in the Americas. But anyway, once I met the Latin America Working Group, I never left it. It was a home for me. It allowed me to kind of channel my energies. And my energies, the Latin America Working Group was a group that began in the early 60s. Before I joined it, it was largely started by people in the left Christian movement. People came from the States, people from Canada, who were very, very concerned about Canadian foreign policy, who wanted to do more research on corporate involvement, to explain why our Canadian policy was so linked to the US imperialist policy. They were working against the imperialist boycott of Cuba. They were reacting to the coup in the Dominican Republic, which had bought 42,000 troops, US troops, and the Canadian foreign government, our Canadian government had said, wow, this is great, we're with you all the way. And very concerned about how attached we were to these very, very powerful imperialist maneuvers, including coups in Latin America. So, and that included monitoring of corporations like Brascan, who had at one point took over Light and Power Company in Brazil. Brazil, at that time, there'd been a coup. Goulart had been overthrown way before, and there was a lot of torture and there was a lot of torture going on. At that time, Latin America Working Group didn't have any labor work. Actually, I think I was the person that brought labor into the panorama, and after that, we became very, very focused on labor. So I came from Montreal, and I joined them because I had experience in Montreal. The labor movement was always more permeable. It was easier to be attached to labor, to talk to labor, than it was in English Canada, I think, at the time, because of particular positions. I don't want to get into all the positions of the Canadian labor movement. It's not of interest to me at this point, because we have managed to have an impact on it, and that's what I want to talk about. So I want to figure out how a small group, it was very tiny, it was a little collective, it was very disciplined. It had no particular political associations with any parties, but we did think we were really important, even if there was only 10 or 12 of us, and that we could bring change. And we were disciplined. And first thing I thought, well, we should, I went to the Dominican Republic, and I think it was in '73. Latin American Working Group had a very, very strong relationship with some of the Christian left but revolutionary art movements in the Dominican Republic. I didn't know that till I got there. And then realized everybody was planning a revolution, and I didn't even know what a revolution was at the time. I thought it was time to find out. And, but anyway, just to say that I began to develop the links with labor in the Dominican Republic. And there were a lot of political prisoners. We were working on trying to get them liberated. But I began to work with the CGT, with the telephone workers, and the Falconbridge ferronickel workers in the Dominican Republic, because I felt that this was lacking in the work we were doing. And of course, the labor movement there was very engaged in the political struggle, very engaged in trying to overthrow or hopefully bring Bosch back to power, or Camagna, or whatever, and to get rid of the Balaguer government. You'll have to remember, we're looking at a dictatorship that really began, just like Somoza in that same period, under Trujillo, and then all of the people that followed Trujillo, which were exactly the same government in power. And the other thing with the sugarcane workers. And we developed links with the sugarcane workers that became very, very important when a group called BACFLY, through the ecumenical movement, began to work and develop in the International Committee of Solidarity with Sugar Workers around the world. And a lot of that was based in Trinidad and places, but also in the Dominican Republic, because we had direct ties with the sugar workers, the Dominicans, and also increasingly with the Haitian workers who were working in the Dominican Republic. This is a very, very rich history. I want to mention it very quickly because there's not much time, but what we're doing now is we're trying to write the history. We're not academics, well, I'm not, but trying to recover the history because it's important to learn from that history and maybe find a way, and maybe some of you are interested in helping us with this, finding a way where we can write a history that's not a book, because youth today are not reading many books. I'm not saying we shouldn't write books. That's not me. I've got thousands of books in my life, and I love them all. But I think we need to find a new vehicle by which we could speak to another generation to say, you can make change, there's things to be done, and there's lots of space in which we can work, and to encourage that kind of effervescence that LAWG had at the time. Aside from the Dominican Republic, I was in the Dominican Republic in the town of Bonao, which was sort of the CIA operative center in the region. I didn't understand all that, but I understand now. But Sacha Goldman, as a very, very important CIA operative, was working out of that town of Bonao because that was the ferro-nickel. We didn't understand then that the Falconbridge nickel mine wasn't owned by Canada. It was actually not a Canadian mine. It was a Canadian mine owned by a series of companies that in the end were controlled by Superior Oil Company in Texas, which was part of the military complex linked to the Republican Party and to the wars. And that's when we realized we really needed to do something about it. So then we really did write a book about Falconbridge. Falconbridge is a company as part of the military-industrial complex, but also of the workers' struggle, both in the Dominican Republic and the mine mill and smelter workers back in Canada, that we developed very strong relationships that lasted years while they were still an independent union, and then they joined the CCU and eventually part of CAW and Unifor, I guess now. Anyway, so I was in the Dominican Republic doing the work with the Falconbridge miners and when the coup happened in Chile, and we were walking through a park, and we were listening to Radio Havana on a little tiny radio, I remember that very quietly, and we heard Allende's last words. It was very, very impactful to anybody because he was asking people to resist, take up arms and fight. And anyway, Latin American Working Group had been working on Chile for quite some time, so I had to borrow $40 to get a bus to get back to Santo Domingo, to get on a plane to get back home, because I knew we needed to be doing something about it. I knew this was a disaster, this was going to be a terrible thing, and I left the Dominican Republic, but I kept working with it and going back and forth for several years, working with the miners and other workers in the country. So we have a very strong relationship that lasted for years, but we also had to begin to deal with the new reality, which was the coup and our government complicity with the coup. They recognized the government. I was just reading some notes last night about how we recognized the government and sent them like big credit, like $5 million worth of credits to Pinochet within 2 months of the coup. And the Latin American Working Group was one of the few groups, and there was a group in British Columbia we have to recognize, which was sort of put together by Rick Craig, who came out of the teachers movement, who started to do work on Chile. Chile opened up a whole gamut of solidarity movements across Canada. I was trying to find where the position, we know where the position of the US, FFL-CIO, and was in boycotting Chile and supporting the boycott of the truckers that led to this final demise of the Popular Unity government. But the Canadian position was very different in the CLC, so I want to say that right away. I don't have a lot of information in that period, but it was different, and they condemned the coup. And that was very, very important. And of course the churches and the others. And then we had to move and try to get quantities of Chilean refugees into the country. And that brought trade union people into the country from Latin America. And that had a very important role to play that we need to look at in Quebec and also in English Canada. And there's no time to get into that. I'm just giving you like places where we need to do some very important research if we want to really gather this rich history. And with them, of course, came all the divisions that came with that was inside the court, the Central Workers in Chile, which was about whether you consolidate to advance or advance to consolidate. I've never forgotten that debate. And I was sort of feeling in the middle of it because I was trying to work with everybody, and that was almost next to impossible. Well, there were those who established outside of Chile the sort of central in exile, the Put that was in exile, and there were those inside who were part of the industrial cordons, who were in the factory areas, who stayed inside, and who were sending out microfiche of information, which were coming to my house. And I remember people saying, this is not true, you're making this up, and I would get them in the mail to these little microfiche inside these envelopes that were coming in from Chile. And then, you know, we had help from people who knew what to do with the microfiche, because I didn't know, and turned it over to somebody who knew, and we would reproduce this information about the resistance inside Chile. All that very rich history is sitting right now. Those documents are sitting at the Surlac, thanks to the work of some marvelous people at Surlac who was able to open some space so that when LAWG was finished in 1990, something or other, all of our archives were saved and our internal papers were saved. And there's a lot of material for academics to research, and we need that kind of help because, you know, we need new people, young people. But I want to say at the same time that the Chile thing happened, and we did the book on Falcon Bridge. It was very important to some labor people. I remember people from the paper workers in Eastern Canada saying, we want you to do a book about our struggles because we need to understand these corporations. So we realized we had to do more work on corporate impact and how they impacted what workers could do or not. And then I decided to go back to Latin America, but I went back to Mexico and Central America. And that's where I got engaged with the Guatemala labor movement, first of all, which was probably the strongest labor movement in the region. It was stronger than what was going on in Nicaragua, Salvador. It was Guatemala. It was very heavily crushed. They beheaded like, I don't know how many leaders. But it also included a very strong indigenous element because all of the farm workers in the fields were organized and sometimes in underground unions and other kinds of unions, and they were all, this is before the peace agreements, and they were working with the industrial workers in the cities. So we had an incredible, very, very broad gamut. So I learned a lot the difficulties, but how you try and overcome, you know, historical prejudice and racism and bring in, you know, these elements of the working class. And I think one of the most terrible, aside from all the massacres, when the army started to move into these territories because they wanted to get to the guerrilla movement, and they thought by taking out all of these campesinos, these farmers, they could, you know, starve the guerrilla movement out. And so they killed a lot of people. I think we don't know, you know, at least 2 million, you know, 200,000, 300,000. Probably closer to 1 million. We don't know to this day. And many, many, many were Mayan peoples. So anyway, just to say that we worked with the Interchurch Committee, not the Interchurch, the International Committee that was coordinating sugar workers. So I did the part in Central Americas because I was there, and worked with you know, sugar workers in the fields in Guatemala because they needed a lot of support, but also some of the mill workers in countries like Salvador, where they were well organized. They were a fairly militant union, and the ones in Honduras. And we were able to maintain a kind of a network of sugar workers in Central America and linked to the larger world organization for many years, mostly for solidarity because of the amount of killings. And there was a lot of killings in the sugar fields. And so I wanted to mention that. So the labor work went on for years, and I haven't, because I was so central to it, I'm still working in the labor movement, so I haven't got time to write any of this down. And now the pressure's on because people like John Dillon, who I worked with, he passed away last year, and a number of people, Sheila Katz, who worked at the CLC. Many of us went on to work in the labor movement and had an